There were two Blackhawks sitting down with the rotors turning, just sitting on the ground. And when I came around, I heard them, saw them, looked at them, and my body just went into a visceral response. And that response was absolutely bit me in half at the middle. Almost like I used to have a beagle dog that would have epileptic seizures. That's kind of what I felt like. All my muscles kind of all contracted. I bent forward, and it was as if my subconscious did not know whether to run away from the birds or run towards them. Obviously, those aircraft had nothing to do with me, but for the first time, my subconscious did not know that. In my subconscious, those aircraft had everything to do with me. And from that moment on, even to this day, I continue to have a visceral response.
Welcome to the Too Curious MD podcast. I'm Dr. Ali Ahmed.
And I'm Dr. Simi Rahman.
In this podcast, we are asking the unasked questions.
We're physicians applying the lens of narrative medicine, exploring integrative practices and psychedelic treatment in healthcare.
Together with our guests, we weave new learnings from stories, expertise, and the sciences. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the show. Today we're having a wonderful and powerful, heartfelt conversation about healing. Not just the kind that happens in hospitals or therapy rooms, but the kind that reaches deep into the soul. Today, we have a special guest who is a combat veteran who served with courage and came home carrying experiences that many of us really can't fully imagine. Like so many veterans, he's faced invisible wounds, the kinds that don't show up on a scan, but are felt every day. In this episode, we want to explore his journey with ketamine-assisted therapy, a treatment that's been offering new hope for those living with trauma, depression, and chronic pain, anxiety, and the like. But this isn't just about a medicine. It's about what truly heals, connection, the honesty that it takes to do this work, the courage, and the willingness to try something new. So whether you're a veteran, a clinician, or someone who's on your own healing path, or simply curious about the power of these conversations, we invite you to listen with an open heart. Let's dive in. Tim A. is here today, and I've known Tim since 2024 when he first came to our center and came in for treatment for, as I said, ketamine-assisted therapy. As a person who showed up at our door, and I always tell patients that it takes a lot of courage to show up through those doors and to really seek the help that you need and trusting the process. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Tim, and how did you first hear about ketamine? What brought you in through those doors?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dr. Ahmad. Yeah, my name's Tim. I retired from the Army in 2012. I spent most of my career in special operations, started my career in the Ranger Battalion, and had a myriad of different experiences, peacetime and combat. I think I was affected physically and emotionally, peacetime and combat. I'm not even sure which was more of the brunt, but I know after I retired, I went on a long time. I would not have said I had PTSD. I would not have said that I was affected at all. I knew I drank too much. I knew that there was a struggle, but I wouldn't have put it towards my time in the service. In fact, I thought I was probably more resilient than most Rangers that I served with. The real visceral response to things going on around me in the community didn't actually begin or didn't become totally evident to me until right when COVID happened. And when COVID happened, people drew in to their buildings and law enforcement kind of took a step out. And what I began to notice was America looked like a war-torn countries that I had been in. We looked like a kind of a country under siege. And at least that's what my conscience, but definitely my subconscious was picking up on. I was working on an airfield at the time and had been for quite a while with no ill effect. And one afternoon I stepped around the building and there happened to be a couple of Blackhawks that had been flying in the local training area. And about probably 300 meters off, there were two Blackhawks sitting down with the rotors turning, just sitting on the ground. And when I came around, I heard them, saw them, looked at them, and my body just went into a visceral response. And that response was absolutely bit me in half at the middle. almost like I used to have a beagle dog that would have epileptic seizures. That's kind of what I felt like. All my muscles kind of all contracted. I bent forward, and it was as if my subconscious did not know whether to run away from the birds or run towards them. Obviously, those aircraft had nothing to do with me, but for the first time, my subconscious did not know that. In my subconscious, those aircraft had everything to do with me. And from that moment on, even to this day, I continue to have a visceral response. It's improved quite a bit, but for a long time, it was just that. It would fold me in half, and it would take everything out of me, and it maybe keep me there for, well, quite a long period of time, often until the birds would lift and take away and get out of my earshot. At that time, I called a buddy of mine that had more combat experience than me, quite a bit more, but had grown up with me as a young ranger back way years previous, and explained to him what had happened to me. It was not an easy phone call to make, and he didn't poo-poo it. He told me that it was normal, and not only was it normal, but he went down the roster of people that I'd served with and went name by name of people that I'd grown up with as a young ranger. And because he was more connected than I had been, he told me each person's story of where they were and what their response was. And each one was totally different, but equally extreme. And his theory was it wasn't the amount of times that you'd been through the door, but it was the training that we did to be comfortable to go through the door, even one time or a few times. And put me in connection with some guys that had some nonprofits. And I began to seek information. And I began a journey to just try to get better. I was in a marriage at the time that did not survive. I don't think it would have survived anyway, but this certainly didn't help things. I had another buddy that was taking ketamine infusions. In Virginia, the VA does not recognize ketamine infusions as a modality for health or for my condition. So my only choice was to come out of pocket for it. And it was very expensive, though at the time I was making pretty good money and really I'd have tried anything at the time because my existence had just overnight become unbearable. Probably the only thing I did right is I didn't take a drink, but I did go and receive ketamine therapy. However, in Virginia, their idea of ketamine therapy was just putting you in a room. You picked your music, you come in with whatever music you wanted on your iPhone or whatever, put your headphones on, and they hooked you up to what we called the spank machine and put diodes on me and left me in a room by myself. They would occasionally come in and check, but there was no therapy, there was no sight and setting, there was no conversations before, there were no conversations afterwards. You got what you got. And I was encouraged from the doctor that it's not what you see when you're out there on the medicine, it's the days following. It's the health benefit that comes afterwards and the new neural pathways that could be developed. Right. And nobody promised me anything, but it might work. And I'd have done really anything for a maybe at that point.
So and I'm going to just kind of really reflect on what you just said about the visceral reaction and the subconscious part of you that seemed to know something was wrong. And also your initial denial, I guess, of that there was anything wrong with that you had PTSD. How did you put this all together? That this is PTSD. This was a visceral reaction that was so incapacitating. Around the time of COVID, you sought out help from a colleague who kind of then helped you guide you through this awareness.
He was the one that helped me piece it together and basically said, hey, you got it, and so do all these other people. And when he went name by name of people that I, had spent a lot of time with, and these were some of the toughest guys on planet Earth, who were really struggling. And the guy that I was on the phone with, I trusted him wholly. And he knew me when I first come in, before I was ever even, I guess, indoctrinated. into the regiment. He knew me, so he knew who I was, and he also knew who I'd become. So that was probably the biggest help, is for him to say, hey, like it or not, sounds like you got this, just like all the rest of us. So that's really what flipped the switch in my head, because up to that point, if somebody would have offered that that's what I had, I'd have probably taken offense to it. Well, I mean, I know I would have. It would have been offensive for me to think that, I was not more resilient than that. We trained to be resilient.
Yeah.
And the fact was, I had went for 10 years not having those visceral responses. Now, as I look back and look at the way I was living my life, yeah, I was definitely self-medicating. I was definitely covering up some of those responses or prolonging them. But, that the way we exercised our jobs was, we would do things, we training or not, we were not allowed to come home and talk about it. We had things we could talk about and things that we couldn't talk about. And the things that we couldn't talk about, we didn't talk about with our families, and we didn't talk about with each other. And it wasn't till, I started, later on in my recovery, I began kind of writing some of these things out just for myself, just to go through them. And that was a big game changer. That and the ketamine, even though there wasn't a therapist involved, it did start to open me up for, just a different way of thinking, a different, I would say, well, maybe that is, maybe instead of being just so cut and dried in my ways, ketamine really, the beginning of it really kind of let me look at things in a different ways that I would have never looked at before. And I found it to be a more accurate way of looking at things.
Did that way of looking at things, how did that emerge?
I believe through the process of the ketamine, like I said, even though there wasn't a therapist there, it did begin to kind of cap on the window and crack the cement that I had just covered. There was events that took place. I just cemented over and kept going, and that's kind of the way we got through it. It worked short term, but at some point that stuff, it all comes out. And for me, it came out sideways in the form of terrifying fear. And that fear came out, I would disguise the fear, and it would come out in the form of anger. And then the anger gave way to just real childlike fear, a lot of weeping, a lot of, and I never knew when that would come on. And when it came on, I couldn't do nothing about it. It would come on in grocery stores, driving down the road, church services, a lot in grocery stores. And certainly every time a helicopter flew overhead.
What was the support or the treatments that helped you during this initial time? You mentioned writing. You mentioned talking to your friend.
I had the friend that was just really initial. I had been given as a process, like I mentioned earlier, I hadn't had a drink since 2011, and I go to a 12-step program for that, and I am sponsored. And at the time, I had a sponsor who gave me the gift of writing. And with the writing, I'd write 3 pages a day every morning. And with that writing, I began to piece together. These weren't, these are letters to God, and letters that I would read to my sponsor, and it would give my sponsor 3 pages of information about how I was doing that particular day. And it was really a kind of a fail-safe one to keep my sponsor informed, but to keep me on the right side of the road. And, I when I say I didn't have therapy with the ketamine, I didn't, where I was receiving the ketamine treatment, but I did have a therapist through that other, 12-step program in the form of a sponsor. That program, they say, if you have outside troubles, seek outside help. And that's what I was doing. But I did find that each program kind of helped out the other. Now, once I came to California, what ended up happening is I ended up having to leave that job because there was so much activity with the aircraft. I was in a metal building, and I would just, when they would fly over, what would happen is my employer would lose a good man and I didn't know how long. Sometimes it would be 20 minutes, sometimes it'd be an hour and a half. Sometimes it would be for the entire rest of the day. I would sit there exhausted. I would sweat. I would soak my shirt. The visceral response wasn't just physical and bending over. I mean, I'd be soaking wet. It was a terrible thing. And, I was carrying that by myself, but I knew I was missing huge things on work. So I actually had to pull the heads of state in and let them know that I was not doing the job they thought I was doing. I wasn't doing the great job they thought I was doing. And they, oh, no, yeah, you are. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm missing a lot. And that was probably the hardest conversation that I'd ever had, is telling those guys that I was no longer the guy that they had hired to do that job. And it would have been irresponsible for me to continue. Very irresponsible, because I knew that I was missing big things, and they didn't know that. So I had that conversation, and they tried to get me to stay, and I had to convince them that no, it was much worse than they thought. Most of the time I was alone on the job, so nobody knew what I was going through except me and the one guy that I'd called on the phone, who had nothing to do with my work. So they finally got the point that really something had happened along the way. Something had mechanically slipped in my mind, in my, I call it my brain housing group. I mean, something had definitely slipped, and I was no longer able to do the job. So, and it was a great job. It was, I was making really good money, wasn't working too terribly hard. It was a great job, and I felt like I was, really making a difference. So having that conversation, like I said, that was the toughest conversation I'd ever had, but I knew I needed to have it. And I got a guy in there and was able to get him trained up best I could. And, I found my own backfill, and I moved to California. When I moved to California, I immediately plugged in with the VA. I knew I couldn't work because it had become a safety issue. I'm an old roofer, but I mean, I certainly couldn't be hanging on the top of a ladder somewhere and have one of these things, happen, because I didn't know how my body was going to respond. So I got with the VA, and I had heard a rumor that the VA out here was recognizing ketamine therapy as a modality for guys like me. And what I'd been diagnosed with, I'm 100% VA disabled. And a big part of that 100% is PTSD, complex PTSD, which is multiple events, and severe depression as a result of the PTSD. So I plugged myself in immediately with the VA, and I had done everything that the VA had to offer in Virginia except for taking meds. Well, I had some meds. I'd tried the meds, and I knew that's not the route I wanted. I did not want to go that route. But as far as I did narrative processing, I did group therapy, offhand, I can't think. But anyway, whatever they had to offer, I did it in Virginia. And I came out to California, and they looked at my records, and I was interested in what else could I do. My buddy, who I initially called, who, like I said, had a lot more experience with this than me, said, Tim, the VA can't help you. He said, we're 1% vets. 1% of vets did what you and I did. And to be honest with you, the VA has no idea what to even do with you. He said, but there are outside treatments. And he was talking about ketamine. He was talking about some even more bizarre stuff that was going on down in Mexico, which I wasn't considering that as a modality for me anyway. But anyway, I found out that ketamine was offered, and it was considered as a modality for health. There was one person in the VA that I had to convince that I was a candidate for it. And what that was, to be a candidate, I had to have ruled out all the different medications, the types of SSRIs or whatever. I can't remember now, but there's different kinds of medications, and they were able to look back in my records and see, yep, he did try those. And as soon as she was able to identify that opened the door for me. And through just I don't believe in coincidences, but that's what it looked like, through someone that my girlfriend knew, I found out about Shawn Mines. And I actually went to the VA with Shawn Mines as kind of the target place of where I wanted to go, just because I had heard good things. And and the rest is, that's kind of how it happened. Once I got there, of course, I found out that with a therapist, you take your healing now, and from here to, it really went at a steep angle for me.
Yeah.
And I continue.
I can definitely hear so much courage, so much agency, even as you're thinking back about the things that you needed and the ownership that you took in something that is often stigmatized in healthcare, right? Mental health, being incapacitated, being unable to do the things that you wanted to do. There's so much stigma around that. And yet your awareness and your motivation to really heal really showed up very early, from what it sounds like. You really went through and struggled, but definitely, you went through the process, which is not a lot of people can do that. And I really want to give you that credit for the work that you did even before you showed up, finding those resources and really just acknowledge where you were at the time and the impact it was having on you and in your life at that time, especially around COVID, right? Which is where a lot of things showed up in the healthcare setting. As a physician, really mental health just took a downward spiral, and all we saw was in any setting was the impact that mental illness had with COVID and with the impact of that access and the loss of access had to healthcare. So I really want to give you a lot of credit for navigating through all of that.
Yeah, if you remember right, there was a call that went out and said that, if you weren't priority, they didn't even want you to leave your house. And I was considered priority. So I was driving those streets that used to be, so much more filled with people, and it really, hometown USA, where I lived there, really began to look like an occupied country, because that's what happens in an occupied country. They tell civilians to stay in, and you'll see the police force kind of come out, and that's exactly what happened. So I think that was the big trigger. That, and walking into places, not having a mask, and getting, the hand in the face, hey, you can't come in here. That was terribly hard for me. Or like I said, at least for my subconscious. Like,
Yeah.
something's definitely triggered for sure.
What was your mindset like? For a lot of people who haven't done ketamine or anything like this, because ketamine is, and I say this to patients, it's only a tool. It's not a medicine that's going to suppress your symptoms. It's not a medicine that's going to cure you. It is a tool to get you to where you need to go if you're open and trust that process. But coming into it, would you be able to kind of give us a little bit of an idea of what that first session was like when you did it in Virginia versus the session that you had with therapy?
When I first came into Virginia, I remember I was tearful, and I was terrified, not of the medicine, not of the trip, not any of that. I pretty much field tested my body and all kind of stuff when I was younger. I was terrified that I wasn't going to get any better. I was terrified that they were going to throw everything they had at me and it wasn't going to work. And that was my biggest fear, is that, all right, here I am. I mean, I'd have literally done anything. I'd have tried anything. And at this point, I figured, okay, this is pretty heavy duty medicine. And of course, I thought I was special, thought I was different, thought my case was worse than the next guy, which I found that not to be true. But yeah, I was terrified that it wasn't going to work. As opposed to when I came to California, the other thing was the difference. You got to remember, I was coming out of pocket out there. So I would go for, I did the initial battery of maybe 8 to 10 infusions, pretty quick back to back. And they wanted to see me about every month. Well, that was starting to get pretty expensive, especially after the 8 to 10 initials. And, at first it was easy to hit every month. But after that, it was getting kind of expensive. So I would try to stretch those months, and boy, it would come back on me like a wet wool blanket, just when I would get too far away from those infusions. And like I said, this was without therapy. That was Virginia. When I came here, there was no fear. Well, the fear I had was I wasn't going to be able to convince that doctor, that VA doctor, on a Zoom call. She was in Reno, I was in California. I was not going to convince her that I was a candidate, and she was, boy, someone had already kind of given me a hint that probably wasn't going to be a big fan of this. So basically I needed to really let her know what ketamine had done for me, and what not being on the medicine was beginning to do to me, because the demons were coming back. So anyway, when I was approved, and when I first walked in and saw you guys, there certainly wasn't any fear. It was all just, I was just I was excited that one, I was understood, right? Because everybody wants to be understood. I really wanted to be understood because I didn't understand it. I didn't understand me. I didn't understand what had taken place in my mind. So to walk in there and be understood, to have a therapist, to have a doctor, that was the night and day difference, and I can remember my first couple treatments. Of course, I had the therapist there with me, but I also had follow-up Zoom calls with the therapist and the psychologist, Dr. Smith, if you remember.
Psychiatry, yeah.
It's like, everybody got it. They got it, and I remember telling him, "Hey, doc, ketamine's great, but the symptoms do come back. Maybe not as strong, but they come back." And he got it. He got it, and he advocated for me. So there was no fear like I had. There was no fear that it wasn't going to work, because I already knew it was going to work. And if it worked in the spank machine room, like we called it, then it was certainly going to work having a therapist and putting some emphasis on site and setting. And it was a night and day experience, and I knew that when I walked into the building, even before we got started. When I first walked into the building, it was so night and day compared. I mean, what I was walking into in Virginia, it was like a methadone clinic. It was just night and day, different experience. So no fear, just relieved that, these people seem to get me real, they got me, they understood.
And that's really important that you say that, because everybody's different, and everybody's process and everybody's experience in their condition is so unique. And in narrative medicine, we really talk about the story and the context of conditions, right? What is that context or that story that person lives in and experiences on a day-to-day basis that they know best. No one can know that other than you. And there's a lot of humility that has to be there for, I think, in healthcare, to really acknowledge that there is something that we don't know as physicians, and we really have to learn as you experience and share to that process as it unfolds in treatment. So I really want to acknowledge that is an important part of this work, is that the answers are not there, and there is so much more that's revealed as people process through their trauma and their illness.
Yeah, and it was fairly early on, and you'll remember this, and this, but for the benefit of the audience, it was after my initial battery, and it was one of my infusions where you actually came in the room, and I was in the twilight. I mean, I was just barely, I don't think I'd even had the little bit of food there. What do we call it? The
Nourish bowl.
The Nourish bowl. I hadn't even got to the point where I could even wrap my hands around eating the nourishment bowl yet. And you walked in, but I could hear your words, and I could hear your words, and I could process with my mind, but I really wasn't moving well yet. And it's kind of still. And you walked in and you said, "Hey, this is an exercise I like to do when patients are in the what we call the twilight state." And you had a printout photocopy of two anatomical bodies, male bodies, anatomically standing there, one on the left and one on the right, exactly the same, and a huge bowl of chalk. And in that bowl was, I don't know, 30, 40 different colors of chalk. And you told me to, with the man on the left, do the best I could to pick colors from the bowl. You said colors from the bowl, and draw that man the way he felt prior to the infusion. And when I was done with that, I think you gave me all the instructions up front. I think you said, when you're done with that, I want you to take a look at the man on the right and draw him with, again, with colors of your choice on what you feel like now post ketamine, after the infusion. And it was on a clipboard. And the reason why I know it was on a clipboard, because of the pressure I was applying. And I grabbed out of all those colors, and it wasn't me, it was my subconscious, because I remember my arm just kind of shot out there, and it grabbed the brightest color red piece of chalk that I could see in there, brick red. And I grabbed that piece of chalk, and my hand just started whipping across that paper. And you'd have thought that I was just scribbling. And you said, okay. And I did that for a while. And I can remember not even really kind of looking at the paper kind of out of the corner of my eyes, but I was kind of immobilized, but my arm wasn't. And it was just carrying on like it was, a graph reading a lie detector test, or a meter reading an earthquake.
Yeah.
My hand was just going. And I remember the chalk was crumbling under the weight. I was really applying pressure, and that chalk was just breaking, and tears were flowing down my face. And it was almost like there was pain, anger, angst, fear, trauma was being extracted from my body through these movements. And then you said, okay. And I was done. And you said, okay, now I want you to go to the next one. And this one's after. How you feel now? And I grabbed the coolest, lightest color, light blue piece of chalk in there. And I very carefully and slowly kind of colored them all in blue, stayed in the lines. Well, when I did come out of the twilight and I did get back into my body, I did have my nourishment bowl, and 10 fingers, 10 toes and all that, and everything came back, and I was there ready for my ride home, walking and talking and moving. You showed me that piece of paper. And the guy on the left, I had drawn very accurately a line across the top of the left ankle where I had a tib-fib break. I had drawn red on my both feet where I have chronic plantar fasciitis. My knees I had colored in red and stayed in the lines. My knees I had colored in red. My hips, which are littered with arthritis from 100 plus low level static line jumps on ground I'd never seen before in the middle of the night, hard landings. Shoulders that I was having trouble with. Everywhere I was having trouble, to include my heart, I drew red, and my brain I drew red. And it was my subconscious that very accurately drew out every injury and every portion of pain in my body in red. That was my first indication that, oh man, we're really onto something here. And I thought, this woman, she's, she sees it. She's really got something going on here. And I really, I knew that, God had me in the right place for sure. And, we've looked at that picture a couple times since then and reflected on that. And it is, the accuracy in that is actually mind blowing. And for anybody that didn't believe in this work, I mean, I feel like I could take that picture and go on to, I don't know, David Letterman's show if he's still around. I don't know. I mean, that was amazing to me. That really was amazing to me. And any doubt I had about, therapy assisted ketamine and having a therapist in the room and some people that really knew what they were doing, that I had no doubt. I mean, that was the most powerful experience that I think I've had in my recovery. And I've done a lot for my recovery. That was pretty mind blowing. And I guess you've done that with other people, but.
And I'll say your process was truly what people, each person extract, what they present, what they feel, how they see themselves, how they see their body, how they disconnect and how connected they feel to that body. It's a feeling body map. It has been used in different somatic therapies and as well as looking at the body, right? The feeling body map, everybody's sense of emotion, that visceral emotion that the body carries is in the cells of the body. It's in every part. It's a memory that the body holds and has to in times of fear, in times of stress and turmoil. The body has to respond. But then it becomes so dysregulated when it loses its indicator for why it's there. And I want to highlight also your subconscious and conscious knowing, because this really comes from Carl Jung's work of what the conscious and the unconscious mind does. And it's really Carl Jung who says, until you can make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Wow. Yeah.
And by making something that was so subconscious to you, so conscious, you were able to really see it, visualize it, represent it in so many different ways, as even in the exercise and even as a visual and even in that emotional state, that twilight state, as you described. Because that's the ideal, that's the window of where we really see so much opportunity to really engage with. The dissolving of the ego gets in the way of treatment, right? When the ego is there, the access to that true self is going to be overshadowed by that ego. And in that twilight state, we shed a little bit of our ego and really are able to access ourselves with creativity, with imagination, with reflection. So it really is a place of discovery, and which is what you did. You discovered yourself in ways that not many people can do and are willing to do. And I think that willingness is really where you show up.
I've heard in recovery that ego stands for edging God out.
That's a good one. Edging God out. Wow. True.
And like you said, not able to get any work done because
Yeah.
ego's standing up, present, up front, running the show.
Yeah. And I will share that picture. I was trying to pull up your picture, but I do have it, and I will, for the audience, really put that in the show notes if you are okay with that.
Oh yeah, I think it's powerful, and just knowing that, really my arm was going 100 miles an hour. There was chalk dust flying everywhere, broken bits. But if you look at the drawing, it looked like I really put some time into it, and each mark on there is actual, and it's an injury.
Yeah, it is. I remember your hand was trembling. We did it as a 4-minute exercise, and you did the first part of it within a minute or so, and you said, "Okay, I'm done." And I said, "Do you want to then reflect on the other part?" And then you noticed it. You said, "Yeah, okay." You continued on
With the blue, yeah.
with the blue, right? So it's really the bridging, the integration of yourself, right? Of the part of you that was really hurting, and the part of you that wanted to heal, and the part of you that was really truly you and where you are now.
Yeah, it's powerful. Yeah.
There is a difference also to what physicians think when patients are healed. They'll say, "Okay, you're all cured now, you're healed," and to when the patient feels healed. When the patient feels healed, it's not necessarily the same time that when the doctor says you're healed. What would you say for yourself? What healed for you, and when did that really happen?
Well, what my experience has been, each level of healing, it's like peeling back an onion. I find another level that needs attention. The one sponsor I had that introduced me to writing 3-page letters each morning explained it to me like this. I was told, look, you're pretty sick and you can get well, you can get healthy. You're not bad trying to get good, but you are sick and you can get healthy. You can get weller. But it was explained like, I arrived to the party, I arrived to recovery, a 55-gallon drum of milk. And each day I write a letter, each ketamine infusion, each time I go to group therapy, each time I have a conversation with my maker, I take a teaspoon of that milk in that 55-gallon drum, and I take it out of the drum and I throw it on the ground, and I take a teaspoon of clear water and I put it in the drum. And over a lifetime, every day I go and maybe twice a day, I take 2 teaspoons of milk and I pull it out of the 55-gallon drum, and then I take teaspoons of clear water and I dump it in the drum. Over time, that milk's going to get thinner, 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 but it's going to be white for a long, long time, probably for life. Although it's going to be very thin, it's not going to taste like milk anymore much. It's going to be quite watered down. And I think why they say dying when they say kicking the bucket is you kick the bucket over, spill it, and that's it. So I feel like I'm 56 years old, and it took me 56 years to get where I am. And it makes sense that it's going to take at least that to climb back out. And sometimes as I fall through the tar and get to my sickest points, some self-induced and some through no fault of my own, situational, areas in my life where I found myself in situations that added to my sickness. But anyway, the further I go down that muck, down that bucket of tar, now as I become healthy, I got to come back through it. And sometimes getting healthy feels like you're going insane because you're passing back through those same areas, coming back towards health. And that's kind of the way I look at it. I don't expect to be done by next Tuesday. I would like that to be the case, but I know that's not the reality. And by putting myself in that kind of time constraint, that's unhealthy in itself. It's not realistic. I think I'm going to be at this for a long time. I think I got to surround myself with good people. I got to have relationships with people that, are people that I can trust. And, I work on making better decisions every day. I don't know. I mean, I think for someone to sit back and cross their arms and say, okay, I've arrived, I think they're really cutting themselves short.
Thank you for bringing in that metaphor and that analogy of something that really gives a lot of understanding and in a very creative way about what healing feels like and how, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about healing, right? And that it's a daily thing. It's a process that requires so much more than just the medicine. It is that connection to yourself. It's that connection to people around you. And I see this also that when that shift happens from where you were to where you are now, there's always that fear of going back and falling back. And then there's that, who am I now? And everybody else, there's another metaphor that comes up, which has to do with Plato's allegory of the cave. And it's an allegory. It's a story around this man along with other prisoners, and they're chained to the wall of a cave. And behind the wall of that cave is a walkway, but there's a fire behind the wall. And the people walking back and forth behind that wall make shadows up on the wall facing the prisoners who are chained, to the wall. But they cannot see behind that wall. They can only see the shadows that are made on that wall. And they live there, and they live in this dark cave, but all they see is the shadows. And they believe that to be the world. That is what they see, is what is real for them. Until one day when one of the prisoners leaves the cave, is able to escape. He's able to leave the cave and step out into the light, and he sees everything of the world outside. It's bright, there's people, there's things happening. And he's just like, wow, this is the world. So what I was seeing was something else, and what is real is something else. And excited, he comes back into the cave to tell the other prisoners who are still chained to the wall. And as he comes back into that dark cave, of course, now he can't see in the dark anymore, And so he's rubbing his eyes, and he's trying to tell them, those prisoners, that, hey, I have to tell you about the world. This is not the world you're seeing. And he's rubbing, and he looks kind of crazy to them. And they look at him like, what's wrong with you? You can't see anymore. And he's, no, and you have to understand, this is what you're seeing is not real. The world is out there. But they don't believe him, and they stay attached to the wall, knowing that they could still be free. But they believe this is the reality that they accept, that they are fixed to. And this goes to, what happens when people heal too. And, that the perceptions change, the world changes, their views change. And coming back to something that was so familiar isn't so much more different. And that may involve, how they used to be with their family or how they're seen now. And to, the effect of what we really are attached to, right? Social media, people believe that the world is in what they see in their phones, and they believe that to be true. But it can only happen when one is able to say, I can see things differently. I can see things broadly. And this is also where ketamine and medicines like this, when people are really doing the work, are able to open and shift into a broader understanding of themselves and the world that they live in. So I just wanted to share that with you as I see this among so many patients. So what are the things that you would tell somebody, whether it be a veteran or a person you saw on the street or a friend, just like the friend that you talked to? What would you tell them about ketamine treatments, trauma, and ways of healing?
I would encourage, those who are suffering depression, PTSD, suicide ideologies. It's a game changer. I think there's work that can go along with it that can enhance it. I think for me, it's writing. But even my writing has improved since the ketamine. My writing goes a little bit deeper. It's a little more clear. It just, for me, it's been a game changer. For vets that I know that have done it, it's been a game changer. I think if they're on the fence, it's probably a lot of fear. I think ketamine, got a bad rap somewhere along the line. I have heard recently that they were using ketamine as a battlefield, kind of like a morphine. Yeah. And it did not work out so well because they're hauling the people go under, but they're still receiving information. And, they wake up in Longstool, Germany, and all of a sudden they got PTSD because, so I don't think it's for every event, but as far as a modality for healing, I think it's a game changer. I definitely wouldn't be where I am today without it. I mean, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation or any kind of conversation. I wouldn't be having any kind of conversation with anybody on this level without it. It's definitely turned my life around. It's making, I'm in a relationship, that's possible for me today, which I don't know that it's ever going to totally shut down some of the visceral responses I have. I don't think I'm ever going to be a, CEO of a corporation because of some damage done. I don't think that's ever coming back. But, the fact is, I'm okay with it today. I'm okay with that. I'm okay being in recovery. I'm okay with the understanding that, I'm probably going to be in recovery for the rest of my life. I mean, I hope I am. I'm just so thankful. I'm so thankful to have, a team of people around me and they get it, Like you said, it's not the everything, but it's a huge ingredient in my health today, in my mental health and my emotional well-being. I mean, I used to really, really struggle, and sometimes I still do, but I struggle well. And that's what, I went to, like, I don't know, I want to call it a PTSD camp. It's Boulder Crest, Virginia. And they got quite a program there. And that's what they say, that it was put on by vets who are recovering from post-traumatic stress. And basically they say, hey guys, if you got this, you're probably going to have it and you're going to struggle. But the idea is to struggle well and to thrive. You can thrive again. You might not have the job you want. You might not even qualify to be the Walmart greeter because you might be a little gruff, or you might, you might not be the right guy for that. But I can, I struggle well today. I do well. I do things, I have fun. I don't just do recovery all day. The other day we went paddle boarding. That kind of stuff was off the table for me. You wouldn't have found me out there standing on a paddleboard, or even thinking I could stand on a paddleboard.
Right.
You know, you told me one time in a group setting, hey, guys, you know, go have fun, do something, have fun, go, go take it, go have fun. And, you know, today I do that. Today, Arlene and I will get on my motorcycle and we'll take a trip, you know, and it doesn't have to be crazy, but we have a lot of fun. And, you know, I struggle well. I got the sticker on one of my cards that says struggle well, you know, and that's been the difference for me. And, you know, I think I said it in the group therapy the other day. If you took a real close-up look, you might see this a little bit in my life. But, you know, just like, I don't know, one of these guys that sells you on the fact that he can do great things with your money, you know, if you took a kind of a view from out, you know, you would see my life definitely improving, and a pretty steep slope, you know, a pretty steep slope when you consider where I was even when I first walked into Shaman's, you know, walking, you know, dragging my lip or whatever, dragging my lip, limping from my hip, you know. I mean, I was even then, which wasn't too terribly long ago, you know, the improvements, it's there, you know, it's quantifiable. Today I can quantify my recovery, you know, and you know, I have these good ideas that come up, you know. Well, those ideas were in me, but you know, the whole idea of ketamine is, you know, it allows my conscious thought, my circular chatter, my unresolved chatter, my, you know, just to lay down for that 90 minutes or whatever it is, and let my subconscious come up, and, you know, things that I heard or things God's put on my heart that have just been absolutely overrun with the chatter and some of the poor decisions that I've made and the terrible neighborhoods I've allowed myself to walk through. You know, it allows that to lay down long enough for the stuff in there that's deep within me to come to light. And all of a sudden I feel like, oh, I got this great idea. Well, it didn't just pop up. It was in there. It was in there, and it was been allowed to unshackle. You know, just, and that's the biggest thing, I think.
So many things, so many parts of you. So much. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for allowing this conversation and, you know, and being vulnerable in this space. I think it's not an easy place to really talk about for a lot of people. But thank you for being here and sharing to your story and giving others an opportunity to see the inside view of what this kind of looks like from your perspective. It gives it's so much more powerful than, you know, than what we talk about it as a prescription, right? Your reflection of what you've done and what you experienced really gives so much more hope for us, so many others. So thank you for being here for that. And
thanks for having me, Doc.
You're welcome.
Thanks for taking a shot.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on the Too Curious MD podcast. We hope today's episode inspired you to ask new questions and explore fresh perspectives. We challenge you to ask us those unasked questions that you're curious about in your medical practice, condition, health, and wellness.
If you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe, share it with somebody just as curious, and leave us a review. It helps us keep the curiosity alive. Post or comment with a question or curious inquiry that you have and seek to explore or learn with us. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.